Hi everybody, let's talk about Chapter 3. So in Chapter 3 we're talking about knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world, or memory, and how memory plays into being an advantage for us as designers. So what we can do is we can have precise behavior on how to do something without precise knowledge of the task. And the book talks about 4 different reasons as to why we can have such an ability for precise behavior. And the first one is that information's in the world. So, much of the information required to do a task can be in the world already. This in turn causes your behavior to take information that's coming out of your head, information that you're seeing in a situation, with information you already know from being within the world, putting it together, and then giving you the ability to do something, coming up with the conclusions that you need to perform an action. And this is something that happens a lot in web design. This is something we consider a lot that we'll talk about later in this video. Also, there's the fact that great precision is not necessary. When we're looking at accuracy and the completeness of knowledge in a general area, you don't really need to be an expert to do most actions that you encounter. All you really need is a good enough knowledge to make sure that you're making the correct choice in comparison to the other choices that are available. So you don't have to know everything about a designed piece before you can choose to act. You just have to have a good enough idea of what's going on. Then there are the fact that there are natural constraints present. The world in general restricts the allowed behavior. The physical properties of how people interact with things constrain possible operations. And this is something that becomes a big deal for us as web designers when we're talking about accessibility. Because in that way, these are natural constraints that are being placed on our users. So we're trying to work our way around these natural constraints in order for our users to still be able to get the information and have the ability to do a behavior on our website. So, in the book, the author really talks about physical products here in relation to how features are limited based on, the physicality and constraints in the real world. However, those constraints can also transfer over to the digital world. It just transfers over in a bit of a different way because it changes to be physical constraints with how the users will access information versus physical constraints presented by the actual product itself. And then there are also cultural constraints. So society over time changes and adds conventions that cause behavior to be normal or abnormal or acceptable. This is essentially what sociology is all about. While you're designing, you have to learn about these cultural conventions, and you have to be able to apply a wide variety of circumstances. I'll give you an example here. I was reading a study once about recognizability and relatability. And they were showing people of different cultures and different countries, they were showing them all faces. And the most universally relatable face out of all the faces that were shown to all of these people of different cultures was just the simple, plain, smiley face like the emoji. The idea there being that any more complex faces look more like one person or another. You know, might look like a person from this part of the world or that part of the world. And in that sort of way, it becomes less relatable for someone who doesn't quite look like the face that they're being shown. But the simple cartoony smile face allows the user to project themselves onto the image, and it makes it extremely relatable. So these are cultural constraints that are present. If you want your product or your website or whatever you're making that you're, designing to be universally accepted and universally understood, you want to be able to make something that can be applied to a wide variety of people, that people all across the world can relate to. You don't want to get into some of these things that would be more culturally significant for one group or another, because that would cause it to lose a bit of its relatability. So let's quickly talk about memory. And when we're talking about memory in this instance, we're really talking about memory in two different senses. Because memory is knowledge in the head. So when we say memory is knowledge in the head, what do we mean? Well, in this kind of instance, we're looking at memory like you would study it in psychology class. There is long-term memory and short-term memory, and we can commit things to memory and go through the process of retrieval to pull things out of memory. But for our purposes, there are three important categories of memory. And that's the memory of arbitrary things, the memory for meaningful relationships, and the memory through explanation. So memory for arbitrary things, this is just sort of meaning, or sort of memory for memory's sake. There's no real meaning for this. And then you have memory for meaningful relationships, which is a deeper level of memory, because not only is it a memory for you, but it's a connected memory for you. You have a meaningful relationship with whatever this thing that you're remembering is. It elicits that emotion that we talk about when we talk about, design is emotional. And then we have memory through explanation. And that's some explanatory mechanism. If you... there's a technique in education called the Feynman technique, and it's basically trying to get people to explain things to you like you knew absolutely nothing about the subject that they were trying to explain. And through that, the person who is explaining things actually strengthens their own memory of what they're explaining, because they're engaging this explanatory mechanism to inform you of what you need to know. And this is efficient memory, and this is efficient, but it does require learning, and retrieval of this type of memory is not the easiest, because it's difficult to, you really have to be thinking about it. It's difficult to go in there and pull it out. But memory is also knowledge of the world. And I mean, in this instance, it's kind of like how many of you have been out somewhere, you know, maybe went on a hike or went camping or just went to the mall or something, and you saw something that reminded you of something else. So these cues that are in the world can spark your memory and bring things to light, things that you hadn't thought of. And then there are natural mappings. Some things are just intuitive, and they happen out in the world. You know, like when you think of like the dial on your stove. You know, you're doing a 180-degree turn, and it goes from low to high. You know, there's a real natural, intuitive method to that. It's not really, you know, like you never really had to learn how to control your stove when you're talking about one of those simple old style stoves. It was just intuitive to the point where you understood it. And these are much more easily retrievable because they're cued. There's no learning required by these things. It's just natural, intuitive things that just spark to your mind based on things that you've experienced in nature. And when it comes to knowledge in the world for web design, there is an entire sector of web design theory that's devoted to just that. And those are web design patterns. So when you look at web design patterns, you're looking at things that are being utilized on other websites a great deal. And if they're extremely popular, if they're used enough around the web, then people just get used to using them. Here are some different UI patterns or user interface patterns that I got from uipatterns.com. And it shows you all of these things that are considered patterns, and you can think about, as you read this list, how many websites actually use these patterns. And the reason to use these patterns is because of the knowledge in the world. So many websites use these patterns that the knowledge is in the world. And so when you use them on your website, your user doesn't have to learn anything new because they have memory, knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world of how to use all of these elements. Things like fill in the blanks, things like CAPTCHAs, things like the password strength meter, navigation tabs, breadcrumbs, modals. You know, all of these things are things that people use a lot on other websites. And so we're taking advantage of memory, we're taking advantage of knowledge in the head, we're taking advantage of knowledge in the world by using web patterns when we design new websites and not trying to reinvent the wheel. That's chapter 3 in a nutshell. Thank you for listening.